The millionaire's son had never walked until he saw the new maid do something impossible. The Caldwell mansion sat on a tree-lined street in the western suburbs of Boston, a place where tall stone walls and wrought iron gates kept the outside world at bay. Everything inside was eerily quiet, like a grand cathedral where even time dared not whisper. Grace Miller arrived on a Monday morning, resume in hand and nerves bundled tight. She was 45, a former community hospital nurse who had taken this part-time housekeeping job to pay for her mother's urgent heart surgery. The moment she stepped inside, the head housekeeper, Agnes Holloway, stopped her in the hallway. "There are rules in this house," Agnes said, her voice soft but sharp as steel. "First, you don't speak to Mr. Caldwell or the boy unless they speak to you first. Second, you never ask questions about the family. And third, and this is crucial, what happens in this house stays in this house. Understood?" Grace nodded, gripping the strap of her worn handbag. She was led down a hallway paved with marble tiles, beneath a high ceiling where a massive crystal chandelier hung, casting reflections onto the walls lined with classical paintings. The house was silent, luxurious yet lifeless. Ethan lived upstairs in the room at the end of the hallway. Its white wooden door remained perpetually shut. Agnes, almost whispering, added, "You are not to enter the boy's room. Only Miss Helga, the rehabilitation specialist, has permission." Grace said nothing, but in that moment she sensed it. Whatever lay behind that door, it was deeper than a physical injury. It was pain that silence couldn't hide. On her first day, Grace began work on the ground floor, cleaning the living room, dining room, library, and kitchen. Everything gleamed. The house was so pristine, it seemed untouched by dust or life. There was no music, no laughter, not even idle chatter. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, echoing like a heartbeat in a hollow chest. Grace moved silently, her steps light, her breath quieter still. She wasn't afraid, but something about this place made her feel like a guest in a museum, not a home. It didn't welcome people like her. It tolerated them. While polishing the living room windows, she heard the faint sound of wheels rolling across the floor upstairs. Then a stop. Silence. Then a soft thud against a wall. Her head lifted instinctively, heart tightening. But she remembered Agnes's warning. "You're not to go upstairs unless instructed." That afternoon, while mopping the hallway floor, another sound broke the silence. Crying. Soft but persistent. Broken. Not the whiny sobs of a spoiled child, but something deeper. Raw, restrained pain. The sound of a child holding back tears. Grace froze, mop still in hand, eyes fixed on the ceiling, on the floor above where the sound came from. A part of her wanted to pretend she hadn't heard it. But how could she? She had once cradled the dying in silence. And this wasn't just a child's cry. It was grief, unspoken, wrapped in the voice of someone too young to carry it. And this wasn't physical pain alone. It was pain from somewhere far more fragile. The crying stopped. Then came a sharp, accented voice. "No, Ethan, focus. You must try harder or you'll never walk again." It was Helga. Then another thud, something dropping to the floor. Ethan's choked voice followed. "It hurts. I'm tired." Grace shut her eyes, willing herself not to listen. But the words pierced straight through her chest. Something was wrong, very wrong, on the second floor. Grace was no stranger to silence. She had lived many years alone, raised 3 children who were now grown and gone. In time, she had learned how to live without hearing Mom each morning. But the silence in this mansion was different. It was cold. It sliced through the air like winter wind. And it hid something she couldn't name yet, but she could feel it, deeply. Then, on the 3rd morning, the unexpected happened. Grace was mopping the second-floor hallway, just as assigned by Agnes. She always kept her distance from the final door at the end of the corridor, Ethan's room. But that morning, as sunlight poured through the tall windows and spread across the cold marble floor, she heard a soft creak behind her. She turned and saw him. Ethan Caldwell sat in his wheelchair, his small hands gripping the armrests. He was so thin, his pajamas seemed 2 sizes too big. His eyes were puffy like he hadn't slept, but they were bright, so bright, and fixed on Grace. She froze, breath held. I didn't mean to scare you," Ethan said softly. His voice was quiet, fragile, but impossibly polite. Grace offered him a gentle smile. "You didn't scare me, sweetheart." He rolled his chair closer, slowly. "You're new, right? What's your name?" "I'm Grace Miller." "You cleaned the floors really well," he said, then paused. "Your eyes look like my mom's." Grace felt her heart skip. "How so?" "They're sad, but gentle." In that moment, she didn't know what to say. She only looked at him and saw the depth of loneliness in those eyes. A loneliness far too heavy for a child. "Thank you, Ethan. I'm sure your mom was a wonderful person." He nodded slowly. Then silence again. But it wasn't empty. Something between them had clicked. Then a sharp voice rang out from the hallway. "Ethan, back to your room!" "Agnes?" She stormed toward them, eyes sharp with disapproval. Ethan flinched. "I told you, Grace, no interaction with the boy." "I'm sorry," Grace replied quietly. "He came out on his own. From now on, remember your role." Agnes turned the wheelchair and pushed it away. Ethan looked back at Grace as if trying to say something he hadn't yet found the words for. Grace returned to her mop, but her mind was no longer in her work, and her heart, quiet for so long, had stirred awake again. Since that morning encounter, Grace had tried to keep her distance. She followed every rule, worked quietly, on time, without a word. Yet sometimes, while mopping the upstairs hallway, she would pause for a moment before that final white door, the room where a lonely child lived. Behind it, she sometimes heard the faint roll of wheelchair wheels, the rustle of a turning page, or the brief sound of piano notes before silence fell again. Each time, her heart softened a little more. That night, rain hammered against the windows of Boston. The wind howled through the cold, empty corridors. Grace had permission to stay overnight in the small staff room downstairs. She was about to sleep when she heard it. A cry, then a sob. "Mom, don't go! Please don't leave me!" A child's voice, Ethan's voice. Grace shot up, heart racing. The sound came from the room above. Without a thought, she threw on her sweater and hurried up the stairs. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow from Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar. Grace pushed it open gently. Ethan lay curled on the bed, drenched in sweat, clutching the sheets. His lips trembled. "Mom, don't leave me. I'm scared." Grace couldn't hold back. She sat beside him, her voice soft. "Ethan, sweetheart, it's just a dream. You're safe now." He woke with a start, eyes wet, lost and trembling. When he saw Grace, he froze, and then broke down completely. "I saw her, the car, everything." Without hesitation, Grace wrapped her arms around him. The boy clung to her, shaking, seeking warmth that had long been gone. She stroked his hair and whispered, "Shh. It's all right, Ethan. It's over now. Your mom's still with you, in your heart." And then she began to hum, the lullaby she once sang to her own children. "Sleep, my darling. Stars above keep watch. In dreams, you are never alone." The melody floated softly through the room, blending with the fading rain. Slowly, Ethan's breathing steadied. His tears dried. He drifted back into sleep on her shoulder. Grace stayed there for a long time, holding him. In the dim light, she looked at his small, fragile face, a face marked by fear, but glowing with a quiet hope. She knew she had just broken every rule in the house. But even if she could go back, she would do it again, because no rule could ever restrain a mother's heart. From that night on, between two lost souls, a child who had lost his mother and a mother who had lost her children, an invisible bond was born. Silent, yet unbreakable. A love that needed no blood to be real. Since that night, Grace was no longer just the housekeeper. Ethan had begun to open up, slowly, cautiously, but genuinely. He didn't say much, but every morning his door was often left slightly ajar, as if silently inviting her in. Grace never overstepped. She didn't teach him to walk, nor interfere with his official therapy. But she did something no one else in the house had done. She listened. While she mopped the floors, Ethan would sit near his door and tell her about the robots he used to build with his mom. When she folded towels, he would doodle and ask her to guess what it was. Slowly, the cold silence of the mansion gave way to small bursts of laughter, awkward but real. One afternoon, Ethan asked, "Do you think I'll ever kick a ball again?" Grace paused, then looked him in the eyes. "If you believe you can, Ethan, then you've already started." From then on, when no one was around, she introduced little games, tapping his toes on a cloth, lifting his foot to music, or imagining he was stepping through puddles. No machines, no clinical therapy, just imagination, affection, and faith. And then one morning, during their toe-tap game, Ethan whispered, "Grace, I feel something, like something touching my toes." Grace froze. She knelt beside him, gently touched his foot, and saw his toes move. Just a twitch. But real. Her voice cracked. "You did it, Ethan." He smiled, a full glowing smile she hadn't seen in months. It might have stayed a quiet moment between the two, if Charles Caldwell hadn't walked by. He was heading down the hallway to summon Helga for a meeting, but as he neared Ethan's room, he heard something unexpected. Laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in this house in 2 years. Peeking through the half-open door, he saw Grace kneeling beside his son, and Ethan, cheeks flushed, trying to repeat a movement in his legs. It was subtle, but real. Real. Charles didn't step in. He simply stood still, overwhelmed. His mind raced with questions. How? Why her? Not Helga, the specialist he paid thousands for each week? That evening, he summoned Grace to his study. "I saw you, working with Ethan." Grace nodded, unashamed. "He wanted to play. I just followed where he needed to go." "You're not trained in physical therapy." "No, I'm not, but I have a mother's instinct." Charles looked at her for a long time. His reaction wasn't what she expected. No anger, no scolding. Just a gaze, as if he was seeing his son again for the first time. "Ethan hasn't smiled like that since his mother died," he said softly. "I don't know what you've done, Grace, but thank you." That night, Grace sat by her window, listening to the wind stir the trees outside. She didn't know if what she was doing was right, but she knew one thing. For the first time, a child was beginning to believe he could walk again, not just with his legs, but with his heart. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee long gone cold, eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. In his mind, the image played over and over again, Ethan's toe twitching. That first smile in 2 long, heavy years. For 2 years, he had tried everything, money, influence, the best doctors, to save his son. But Ethan hadn't responded. No progress, no hope. And now, through simple little games, warm whispers from a woman without a single medical credential, Ethan was changing. The next morning, Charles invited Grace to sit with him at the kitchen table, not as employer and employee, but as two people sharing something far deeper. "I don't believe in luck," Charles began, "but I also can't deny something is happening." "Do you believe Ethan's progress is real?" Grace replied gently. "I didn't heal him, Mr. Caldwell. I just stayed by his side, and maybe that's exactly what he needed." Charles nodded. After a long pause, he said, "I've contacted a psychologist, someone I trust. She's worked with children after traumatic loss. I want a second opinion, outside of Helga's methods." 3 days later, Dr. Rachel Bennett arrived, a woman in her early 40s, calm eyes and a steady voice. She brought no machines, no thick manuals, just a quiet presence. At first, Ethan was hesitant, but eventually he agreed to talk, with Rachel, not in a clinic room, but in the backyard, the same spot where Grace often told him stories. After 2 sessions, Rachel offered her evaluation. Ethan shows no signs of major nerve damage. What he's experiencing appears to be psychogenic paralysis, a psychological response to trauma. It's treatable. The words hit Charles like a wave, both liberating and humbling. Helga, upon hearing this, was furious. "I've worked with that boy for 2 years. These methods, emotional, unscientific, irrational." "Emotional," Charles echoed, "but effective." After a heated discussion, Helga packed her things and left in silence. The door closed behind her, marking the end of a cold, clinical chapter. Charles stood on the porch, watching her car disappear down the drive. Then he turned back inside, toward the garden, where a little boy was laughing, and a woman sat beside him, as patient as a mother. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that some things the mind can't explain, but the heart understands. After Helga left, the house grew quieter, but no longer cold. The heavy air seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, calmer. Even the stone walls felt like they could finally exhale. Rachel continued visiting weekly, never bringing charts or diagnostic tools. Instead, she sat with Ethan on the porch, talking about simple things. His favorite movies, colors he didn't like, dishes his mom used to make. She never forced him, never rushed. Above all, she understood one truth. For a child to believe he deserves healing, he must first feel heard. A week later, Rachel spoke privately with Charles. "Ethan needs movement therapy, but not the old way. I know someone, not famous, not clinical, but her heart is in the right place." Lena Ross arrived on a Monday morning, a woman in her early 30s with a ponytail and a backpack full of toys, plastic balls, colorful paper, and even musical instruments. She didn't greet the household with stiff professionalism. Instead, she knelt to Ethan's level and smiled. "Hey there, what's the name of today's superhero?" Ethan looked at her for a moment, then giggled. "I'm Ethan." From that day forward, every therapy session became a mini adventure. They didn't call it therapy, they called it playtime. And so Lena created imaginary games, hopping over invisible traps, navigating cotton oceans, launching space missions with toe-activated controls. Ethan moved without realizing, no fear of pain, no dread of obligation. Once Grace watched from afar. Ethan was playing a game called Detective Toes, giggling as he lifted a small ball using the top of his foot. He turned to Lena. "I did it. I lifted it." Lena high-fived him. "Exactly. Those leg muscles are waking up." Charles, too, began to get involved, at first just watching from the door, then smiling. Then one evening he brought out an old soccer ball, Ethan's favorite, from years ago. "Remember this one?" Ethan looked at it, then tapped it gently with his right foot, no hesitation. He looked at his father and nodded. "I want to try again." Grace watched it all from the background, never intruding, never directing. Just there, like a tree in the garden, steady and unnoticed, offering shade without asking for praise. But deep inside, she knew Ethan was coming back. Not the old version of him, but a new one, stronger, happier, and ready to move forward. The following weeks passed in quiet hope. Ethan continued his therapy sessions with Lena, each one full of laughter and imagination. He was now used to lifting his legs slightly, flexing his toes, even sliding his foot across the carpet. And most importantly, he was no longer afraid of pain. The fear that once locked him in place was slowly dissolving in an atmosphere of love and joy. Grace still watched quietly. No longer from behind a door, Charles now often invited her to sit in the garden while Ethan played. No one said much, but the way Charles looked at her had changed. Softer, warmer. That morning began like any other. Lena brought her speaker, played an upbeat tune, and invited Ethan to play No Feet Dance, where he simply clapped and nodded to the rhythm. But something was different in Ethan's eyes, like he was hiding a secret. Charles stood by the door, arms folded, smiling. Grace carried tea to the porch. Rachel had stopped by and sat on the bench by the window. Lena placed a small towel on the floor and turned to Ethan. "Let's try the toe-touch towel game?" Ethan nodded. The music started. He leaned forward, hands gripping the armrests, eyes locked on the little red towel. But Lena noticed he wasn't pulling his leg with his hands this time. He was using his knee. She held her breath. Ethan clenched his teeth. A quiet grunt escaped his lips. And then, slowly, shakily, he rose from the wheelchair. The towel dropped to the floor. Charles froze. Rachel covered her mouth. Grace nearly dropped her teacup. Ethan, through sheer will, stood up. His legs trembled. Sweat rolled down his face. But he stood. 2 seconds. 3. Then he fell back into the chair, panting, but his eyes glowed, like sunlight had broken through. Grace was the first to move. She ran to him, knelt down, took his hand. "You stood up, Ethan. You did it." Ethan grinned, eyes watery. Lena sniffled. Rachel said nothing, but her eyes shimmered. Charles walked forward, hands trembling. He knelt beside his son and pulled him close. For the first time in 2 years, he cried, "My boy, I'm so proud of you. You did it. You really did it." That evening, the mansion no longer felt like a cold estate. It became a home. Everyone gathered for dinner in the backyard. No lines between employer and staff, doctor and child, father and therapist. Fairy lights hung across the vines. Rachel shared jokes. Lena sang silly nursery rhymes, making Ethan laugh until he hiccuped. Charles looked around the table, then stopped at Grace, who was gently serving food to Ethan with the tenderness of a mother. After dinner, Charles approached her. "There's something I'd like to ask. Would you move in with us?" Not as a housekeeper, as Ethan's companion. Grace looked up, eyes misty. "I'd be honored, not because I need a place to stay, but because I've found a family." That night, in the room now officially hers, Grace sat by the window, looking out at the garden. The wind rustled the trees. And for the first time in many years, she didn't feel alone anymore. Since the day Ethan stood up, no one in that house lived the same way anymore. The boy could now stand on his feet for a few minutes each day. Charles often helped him walk his first steps in the garden, while Grace sat on the porch reading children's stories aloud, as if weaving a brand new childhood. Everything seemed to fall into place. And amid that peace, something else quietly bloomed. The love between Charles and Grace. It didn't arrive suddenly. There were no fairy tale moments, no kisses in the rain, no dramatic stares across a crowded room. It began in the smallest things. In the cup of tea Charles made for Grace every morning, in the way he watched her fix Ethan's scarf, in their shared laughter during board games, and in their silences, comfortable, safe, and unforced. But somewhere inside Grace, a wall still stood. Who was she? A middle-aged housekeeper, former nurse, a widow with no wealth or status. And Charles? A successful businessman, owner of a major finance firm, once featured on magazine covers. Every time he sat near her, every time his gaze lingered a moment longer, her heart shrank a little. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because she didn't believe she deserved it. One evening, after Ethan had gone to sleep, Charles stepped onto the porch where Grace was reading. "Aren't you cold?" he asked softly. "No, I'm used to it." He sat beside her, handed her a cup of ginger tea. They sat quietly for a few minutes. Crickets chirped. A distant car passed by. He remembered the way his late wife used to hum when tending the roses in the back garden. It had been years since that garden heard laughter. Charles turned to her, speaking slowly. "I thought, after my wife died, no one would ever enter my world again." "And I thought," Grace smiled, "after losing my family, I'd just work through the rest of my life." They chuckled, softly. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "Grace, if I said I needed you here, not just for Ethan, but for me, would you believe that?" Grace said nothing at first. She set her book down, clutched her sleeve gently. I'm not sure I fit in your world. I'm not like you." "My world," Charles said, "meant nothing until someone I cared for stepped into it." He reached out, slowly, and placed his hand on hers. Not possessive, not demanding, just a touch, warm and true. "I don't see your past, Grace. I see the present, and what you bring, life, to Ethan, and to me." Grace turned to him, her eyes shimmered. "I thought my heart had been closed for years, but maybe it was just waiting for the right person to knock." They said no more. A gentle squeeze of the hand said it all. In that moment, all differences, class, background, age, faded. They were two people once broken who found each other not by fate, but by choice. The next morning, Ethan rolled out to the porch in his walker. He saw his father brewing tea and Grace playfully adjusting his napkin. He grinned wide. "You two look pretty perfect together." Charles and Grace exchanged glances and laughed. No formal declarations. No grand weddings. Just quiet mornings, shared laughter, and steps that were finally moving forward. A family in their own beautiful way. Ever since Ethan's cheeky comment on the porch, things began to shift, not just inside their little home, but far beyond the vine-covered gates. News spread fast. Charles Caldwell, financial mogul in love with his housekeeper. Mystery woman steals the heart of America's richest widower. No one cared about context. No one wanted explanations. All they saw was a powerful man choosing someone from outside their polished circles. Someone with no title, no wealth, no pedigree. The whispers turned sharp, the headlines sharper. Grace didn't read the papers, but she could feel the change. The way some staff looked at her now. The way the old gardener no longer nodded when they passed. One afternoon at the local market, a well-dressed woman paused, gave Grace a slow, assessing glance, and muttered, "Well played. Smart move." Grace simply smiled, turned, and walked away. But that night, alone in her room, she sat quietly, hand over her heart. A heart that ached, not from shame, but from being misunderstood. She didn't regret loving Charles, or Ethan, but it hurt to be seen as someone who loved for gain, when in truth, all she gave was love. Charles heard of the whispers, and he didn't stay silent. That evening, he stepped into Grace's room, holding an old photo, Ethan's first day standing on his own. "Do you know what I see in this photo?" he asked. Grace looked up. "I see the woman who saved my son, and me, not with status, but with heart. He sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "They can write whatever they want, but I'll write the next chapter of my life with the woman I choose. And that's you." From the doorway, Ethan chimed in. "If anyone says mean stuff about you, Ms. Grace, I'll go tell them they're wrong." Grace chuckled through tears. "I'm not sad anymore, not with two incredible men beside me." A month later, in the garden where Ethan first found his feet, a small ceremony took place. No designer gowns, no celebrity guests, just the people who truly mattered. Grace wore a simple cream dress, chosen with Lena and Rachel's help. Ethan walked beside her, hand in hand, like he had on his first real steps. Charles wore a soft gray suit, his eyes glowing as Grace approached. Rachel officiated, with the same warm voice she used when healing Ethan. True love isn't validated by the crowd, but by the quiet certainty of those who choose it. Charles turned to Grace, holding her hands. "I once lost everything until you walked into my life. Soft as a whisper, strong enough to change my world." Grace whispered back, "I may not have much to give except my heart, but it's yours, for you, for Ethan." Ethan grinned, standing between them. "Now I've got a dad and a mom, best combo ever." No photographers captured that day for the tabloids, but the golden sunset filtering through the trees, casting warm light over the three of them, was the best picture anyone could ask for. No public approval needed, no explanation owed. Just love, honest, strong, and enough. 2 years after that quiet backyard wedding, Grace was no longer just the woman who stood by a paralyzed boy. She had become the founder and director of the Ethan Foundation, a nonprofit supporting children recovering from trauma and loss. The foundation didn't build high-tech clinics or rely on expensive procedures. Instead, it funded humane therapy programs where children could play, express, be heard, and be loved. There was music, there was art, there were companions just like Grace had once been to Ethan. And above all, there was the belief that every child deserves healing. In one interview, Grace said, "We don't heal these children with science. We heal them with heart." Because sometimes pain doesn't need medicine. It needs someone who truly listens. Ethan was now 15, a tall, healthy, bright teenager who loved sports and helping others. He played soccer for his school team, won a summer scholarship to an art institute, and volunteered every week at the foundation that bore his name. Speaking to a group of young children, he once said, "I used to think I'd never walk again, but because of the people who loved me, I stood up, not just on my feet, but with my heart." Charles, once a man who believed he had lost everything, now smiled more than he ever had. He scaled back work, spent time with family, and was usually the first to make tea each morning. Their little home wasn't flashy. It didn't appear in magazines anymore. But it had warm breakfasts, gentle laughter, and love that never faded. Grace still liked sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the sun fall over the garden, where Ethan had taken his first steps. Now, the same garden echoed with the laughter of children from the therapy center next door, built as an extension of the home. One late autumn afternoon, as the family replanted a young pear tree in the yard, Ethan asked, "Mom Grace, do you think love can heal everything?" Grace smiled, looking at the boy, nearly as tall as his father now. "Not everything, but what science gives up on, sometimes love can still save, and love doesn't always cure with answers. It heals with presence." The three of them exchanged a quiet smile. Their story didn't need a fairy tale ending, because it was already beautiful, not perfect, but honest, real. They had walked through pain, loss, judgment, and still they chose love. Love can heal what science cannot.